The day Raymond Cole was interred, the sky delivered rain of a particular, punishing variety. Not the sharp, driving kind that forces a person into a doorway. The saturating kind. The kind that works its way through layers, through fabric, through flesh, through whatever internal fortitude a person assembled before stepping out of the car that morning. 312 individuals attended that funeral service. That number was later confirmed through photographic documentation. 312 people who selected dark clothing, traveled across a town they shared with a dead man, and lowered themselves into hardwood pews to pay final respects to someone they were entirely certain they understood. The floral arrangements alone represented a £4,000 expenditure. White lilies, specifically, because Patricia had insisted upon them as his known preference. The officiating pastor had been delivering his address for precisely 22 minutes when the event occurred. 22 minutes during which a man's entire existence had been compressed into its most flattering configurations: the decades-long teaching career, the elected council position, the youth mentoring initiative, the unbroken record of Sunday attendance, the particular quality of his handshake, the way it communicated to whoever received it that they held his complete and undivided attention. 22 minutes. And then a woman in the rearmost row rose to her feet. She was not a relative of the deceased. She was not a neighbor, not a colleague, not a name on any printed order of service distributed at the entrance. Not a single person present could identify her. Not one witness could confirm having seen her enter. She had materialized, with deliberate and unhurried precision, at some point before the service commenced, occupying the final seat of the final row, positioned closest to the rear exit. In her left hand, she carried a manila envelope. At the precise moment the pastor pronounced the words that Raymond Cole left behind a legacy of honesty and integrity this community would carry in perpetuity, she began to move forward down the central aisle. Every element of the timing, the specific sentence, the specific instant, will become fully intelligible only once the complete architecture of Raymond Cole's actual life has been laid out in detail. Raymond Arthur Cole entered the world in 1962, born second of 3 children in a 2-bedroom terraced house on Millbrook Road. His father maintained employment at the post office for 31 consecutive years. His mother cleaned commercial office buildings until her joints prevented her from continuing. The family possessed neither significant wealth nor influential connections. What they held, by every surviving account, was a reputation for decency. Raymond absorbed that quality and carried it outward into the world as an identifying characteristic. He qualified as a secondary school teacher in his early 20s, specializing in history and English, and subsequently spent 19 years at St. Edmund's Comprehensive, an institution where annual staff turnover ran at approximately 40%, where the pastoral demands were relentless, where the compensation was modest, and where the accumulated weight of the work eroded most educators within 10 years. Raymond remained for 19. Former students, when contacted and interviewed for this account, produced a portrait of Raymond Cole that carries an unusual degree of internal consistency. When a person's reputation is researched thoroughly, contradictions almost always surface: individuals who found the subject difficult, others who were simply indifferent, some who held grievances. Raymond's record generated something rarer, a single repeated descriptor across multiple independent sources. The word was steady. He was steady. He was present. He retained student names between academic years and deployed them the following September. He attended football matches for which no attendance was expected of him. He composed personal references for students who had no other advocate willing to write one. He arrived before required and departed after obligation ended. He performed, consistently and without acknowledgement, tasks that the institution had long ago ceased to classify as anyone's specific responsibility. When Raymond's classroom career concluded, he transitioned into local civic life, securing election as a council member and subsequently occupying seats on the Planning Committee, the Housing Committee, and the Community Outreach Board. For 11 consecutive years he chaired the annual fundraising operation supporting the local food bank. He architected and administered the youth mentoring program that, at the time of his death, had successfully connected more than 200 young men from economically disadvantaged backgrounds with working professionals in the surrounding area. He was, by every observable metric, precisely the category of person that parents reference when attempting to illustrate to their children what a purposeful and honorable life actually resembles. Patricia had known Raymond since both were 23 years of age. Their first encounter occurred at a church social event. Marriage followed 2 years after that initial meeting. 3 children were produced from the union: Thomas, Rachel, and James. 4 grandchildren had arrived between them by the time Raymond died. Every external indicator confirmed the portrait the eulogy was constructing. So it becomes necessary at this point to account for the locked drawer. It occupied the lower left section of the partner's desk in his personal study, a substantial mahogany construction, delivered in 1998 by 2 men who were required to stop and rest partway up the staircase due to the object's considerable weight. Patricia had never regarded that desk as territory requiring her attention. The domestic geography of their marriage had allocated the kitchen to her and the study to him, and the arrangement had functioned without friction for decades. The lower left drawer contained a small brass locking mechanism. Early in the marriage, Raymond had described its contents as confidential counsel documents, materials not appropriate for general circulation. Patricia had received this explanation without skepticism, because it was credible, because her trust in him was complete, and because she was not, in her own subsequent characterization of herself, a woman given to suspicion. Across 34 years of marriage, she had never once requested access to that drawer. The second anomaly she had permitted to pass without sustained inquiry was a mobile telephone. She had encountered it on one occasion, an older handset, an unfamiliar model, charging on the floor behind his bedside table. She had raised it with him. He had attributed it to counsel communication requirements, explaining that reception on his primary device was inadequate in certain sections of the building. She had accepted this. She had left the room. She never encountered the handset again, which carried the clear implication that he had relocated it to a position she would not casually access. She did not pursue the question of its new location. The third concealed element, the one that would subsequently acquire the most significant legal and financial dimensions, was the money. Patricia had not administered household finances during the marriage. Raymond had managed all of it: the banking, the bill payments, the standing orders, the account structures. She had described this arrangement later not as control but as a natural division of labor, consistent with how most long-term partnerships eventually distribute domestic responsibilities. Raymond had been organized and precise, and she had valued that in him. What she had therefore never examined, and had no particular impetus to examine, were the cash withdrawals. Between £400 and £800, extracted from their joint account every 3 weeks across a period of 6 years. The interval was consistent enough to indicate clear intentionality. The specific amounts varied sufficiently to prevent easy pattern recognition on a cursory scan of a bank statement. Whoever had engineered that withdrawal schedule understood, at some functional level, the mechanics of avoiding detection. For 6 years, the structure held. Then Raymond Cole suffered a cardiac arrest in his study chair at 5:47 in the morning on the 12th of September, and the question of where that money had been directed appeared, to everyone involved, to have died alongside him. The woman has now cleared the third row from the rear of the church. No individual has moved to intercept her. No voice has risen in objection. A low, disoriented murmur has spread through the congregation, the sound produced collectively by 300 people confronting an event for which their shared understanding of the occasion has provided no interpretive framework. The pastor has stopped speaking mid-sentence. One hand remains suspended in an incomplete gesture. Patricia, seated in the front row, registered the disturbance at roughly the same moment the rest of the congregation did. Her daughter Rachel, positioned immediately to her left, closed her grip around her mother's arm. Patricia did not immediately rotate to face whatever was approaching. She would later reflect that some instinctual, pre-rational part of her, some depth of awareness that had been quietly managing information for 34 years, had already begun processing the implication that whatever was moving down that aisle had been constructed specifically for her. The woman arrived at the base of the pulpit steps. She appeared to be in her mid-40s. Dark coat. Dark hair drawn back from her face. No jewelry visible. No bag. Nothing carried beyond the manila envelope and whatever she had pressed flat into her coat pocket. She ascended the 2 steps without any hesitation in her movement. The pastor retreated. She positioned the envelope on the lectern surface. She adjusted the microphone to match her height, and it was that sound, the mechanical scrape of the adjustment crossing the absolute silence of 312 people, that finally caused Patricia to turn, because it carried across the room like a detonation. The woman spoke. Her voice was entirely composed. That is the detail that emerged with the greatest consistency across every witness account gathered during the research for this report. Not rage. Not grief. Not the elevated pitch of vindication. Composure of a very specific texture, the kind produced only in a person who has spent an extended period arriving at peace with something devastating. She stated that she had not arrived to destroy anything, and that what was already destroyed could not be fractured a second time. She directed her gaze toward the front row. She stated that she had come because the children of the deceased deserved to know they had a brother. She had come because her own son deserved public acknowledgement that his father had existed. She had come because if a room full of people intended to declare a man a saint, then at least one person who had known a substantially different version of that man had an obligation to say so from exactly that location. She opened the envelope. It contained 43 letters, each handwritten. The earliest carried a date 7 years prior to Raymond's death. The most recent had been written 11 days before it. They were love letters in their category but carried considerably more weight than sentiment. Embedded among them were hotel reservation confirmations, records of wire transfers, a lease agreement for a flat in a neighboring town executed in Raymond's name, and a birth certificate. The birth certificate documented a boy named Marcus, 6 years of age at the point of his father's death. Under the field for father's name, Raymond Arthur Cole. The woman's name was Diane. She had maintained a relationship with Raymond for 9 years. She had been in love with him for 7 of those 9. For the majority of that 7-year period, she had operated under the belief that Raymond was navigating a genuinely complicated personal situation and would, in time, reach a resolution. Across 43 letters, he had assured her repeatedly that doing the right thing was his intention. He was building toward it. He required additional time. The children needed to reach a certain age first. There was a council election that needed to conclude. There was invariably one more condition that needed to be satisfied before the decisive moment could arrive. His heart stopped before any of those conditions were ever fully satisfied. Diane continued her address to the congregation. She stated that she was not soliciting forgiveness or requesting understanding. She was asking everyone present to examine the letters. She was asking them to go home and then open the lower left drawer of the study desk. She held direct eye contact with Patricia for a specific, calibrated duration, long enough to be unambiguous. She said that whatever the drawer contained did not belong to the dead. It belonged to those still living. She set the open envelope on the lectern. She descended the 2 steps. She walked the full length of the aisle back toward the rear of the building. Not one person moved to stop her. Not one voice emerged. A child positioned in the 3rd row produced a cough that, in the total absence of any other sound, registered as enormous. The rear doors of the church opened and closed. She was no longer in the building. For approximately 40 seconds, the entire assembly remained motionless. Patricia would later characterize those 40 seconds as the most extended of her life, not because she lacked clarity about her next action, but because she already understood, in that preverbal register that had been quietly operating within her for 3.5 decades, that Diane's account was accurate. The documentary evidence was unnecessary. The birth certificate was unnecessary. The truth of what had been said was already settling across the church the way the rain outside had been settling across everything all morning. The pastor did not resume the service. The congregation began to disperse. Raymond Cole's coffin sat undisturbed at the front of the building, surrounded by £4,000 worth of white lilies, while 312 people moved silently out into the wet. The burial was postponed. By 3:15 that afternoon, the reception had been formally cancelled. Patricia's sister transported her home. Thomas, Rachel, and James arrived at the family house within the hour. The kettle was boiled and then boiled again. Tea sat in mugs on the kitchen counter cooling because no one was drinking it. Rachel placed a call to the police, not to register any complaint against Diane, whose actions had been entirely lawful. She had entered a public religious service and spoken. She had threatened no one and damaged nothing. Rachel contacted the police because the letters contained a direct reference to a residential property, a flat in Raymond's name in a neighboring town, of which Patricia had no knowledge whatsoever. That property, if it existed in documented form, constituted a component of Raymond's estate, and its existence had immediate and significant legal implications for everything that followed. A detective arrived at the house at 5:40 that evening and remained for approximately 1 hour. He clarified that the matter was civil in nature, primarily an estate question, and did not rise to the level of criminal investigation. He retained a copy of the birth certificate. He recorded notes. He advised Patricia to retain a solicitor by Monday morning and strongly recommended that nothing in the study be disturbed until she had received formal legal guidance regarding which assets belonged to her estate and which might be subject to challenge. Patricia acknowledged the advice and closed the door. At some point during the later afternoon hours, a member of the congregation had captured a photograph. Not during Diane's address at the lectern, during the walk. The extended walk down the central aisle toward the exit. The image captured Diane's back, the envelope at her side, and row after row of stunned faces tracking her departure. The person who took the photograph uploaded it to a local community social media group at approximately 6 o'clock that evening, providing no accompanying caption. By 10 o'clock that night, it had been shared more than 3,000 times. The commentary divided immediately and sharply into two opposing positions. One position held that Diane's actions were a profound violation, that a funeral is sacred ground, that a deceased person cannot respond to accusations made in their absence, and that whatever truth existed, a church on the day of burial was neither the appropriate venue nor the appropriate moment. The opposing position held that Diane had exercised a right, that Patricia was entitled to accurate information about her own marriage, that Marcus was entitled to exist in the acknowledged record, that the community had been systematically deceived, and that the church was in fact the most precisely correct location to challenge a fabrication about a man's integrity, because the church was precisely where that fabrication was being formally institutionalized. That debate continued through the night, through the following day, through the following week. The church issued a formal statement extending sympathy to the Cole family and requesting that the situation be afforded privacy and dignity. The statement did not include Diane's name. It did not acknowledge the existence of a 6-year-old boy named Marcus. It did not engage with the question of whether the eulogy it had sanctioned bore any meaningful relationship to factual accuracy. This is not remarkable behavior. Institutions prioritize their own continuity. It is what they do. What carries genuine significance is what transpired at 11:47 that night. Thomas Cole, Raymond's eldest child, 31 years of age, a man whose temperament witnesses consistently described as quiet and measured, returned to the church unaccompanied. He had left his father's order of service behind in the chaos of the afternoon's events and wanted to retrieve it. He later reflected that he could not construct a rational justification for the urgency he felt about recovering a printed document. He simply knew it mattered. The building was still unlocked. The caretaker was present, clearing the remnants of the floral arrangements. Thomas took a seat in the front pew and remained there for approximately 20 minutes, alone in the emptied church with his father's portrait still positioned on the display stand near the front. He did not pray. He described himself as a person without religious conviction. He simply occupied the space. He said those 20 minutes constituted the only interval during that entire day in which he felt capable of drawing a full breath. Then he returned home. The family did not sleep that night. In the morning, Patricia entered the study. The drawer was secured. Raymond's keys had been returned by the hospital inside a sealed plastic bag containing his personal effects. It took Patricia under 10 minutes to locate the small brass key on the ring. She opened the drawer. Inside were 2 manila folders. Not council documents. There had never been council documents in that drawer. The first folder bore a single letter as its label, M. Its contents included birthday cards, Father's Day cards, and drawings executed on folded sheets of standard paper, the kind of artwork produced by a child between the ages of 4 and 6. Crooked representations of the sun, houses rendered with more windows than architecture would support, a crayon image of a tall figure and a small figure holding hands beneath a rainbow arc written in adult handwriting at the base of each drawing, in the same hand responsible for the 43 letters, "Marcus made this for you." The boy had known Raymond by the designation Uncle Ray. He had not possessed, in the manner that no 6-year-old can possess, the understanding that the man he called Uncle Ray was biologically his father. Diane had elected to wait until the boy reached sufficient maturity, to reserve the disclosure for Raymond to make, to not manufacture a confrontation that Raymond had perpetually promised was imminent. Raymond had visited Marcus 11 documented times in the final year of his life. Diane had maintained the record. Patricia remained with that first folder for an extended period before opening the second. The second folder was labeled with her own name. Inside it was a single handwritten letter, lengthy, filling both sides of 4 separate sheets of paper in Raymond's characteristically small, precise script. It was dated 8 months before his death. Raymond had received a diagnosis indicating that his heart was failing. He had obtained this information privately and had disclosed it to no one, not to Patricia, not to his children, not to Diane. He had elected to deploy whatever time remained to him in arranging his affairs in configurations designed to minimize the damage his death would produce. He had concluded, or had constructed the belief that he had concluded, that the experience of encountering the truth through written documentation following his death would be less destructive than receiving it verbally during his lifetime. The letter contained an exhaustive account spanning 9 years. The circumstances under which he had met Diane. The initial framework of self-deception through which he had classified the relationship as temporary, as an aberration, as something he would terminate before it acquired permanence and consequence. The process by which it became exactly that thing despite every internal narrative he had deployed against it. The moment Diane informed him she was pregnant, and his response, which was to remain with Patricia and to remain with Diane simultaneously, rationalizing the provision of financial support to both households as a functional equivalent of moral responsibility when it was in practice nothing beyond the structural arrangement of a man unwilling to exercise the one decision the situation actually required of him. He had established a private trust. Its capital had been assembled across 6 years of those cash withdrawals, £400 to £800 drawn every 3 weeks from the joint account, transferred into a separate account held in his name exclusively, and from there directed into the trust instrument. At the time of his death, that trust held £74,000. It was legally structured to disburse funds toward Marcus's educational expenses and living costs until the boy reached the age of 25. Diane had been informed of the trust's existence but had not been told its precise value, and she had no certainty that it would survive the legal complications of the estate's administration. Raymond had taken meaningful steps to ensure that his son would be financially supported after his death. He had taken no steps to ensure that his wife knew the truth while he was alive. The letter's closing passage requires precise transmission because it constitutes the document's most analytically significant content. Raymond wrote that by the time the letter was read, he would have run out of courage one final time. He wrote that his entire adult life had been organized around the identity of the reliable one, the steady one, the person who arrived when expected. He wrote that he had arrived for everyone except at the one moment that made the greatest demand upon him. He expressed that he was sorry for his failure to deliver this truth while living, acknowledged that a written apology from a deceased person carries negligible practical value, and stated that it was nevertheless the only remaining thing he had to offer and that he offered it entirely and without qualification. Patricia folded the letter with care, returned it to its folder, placed the folder back inside the drawer, and closed it. She then sat at Raymond's desk for 2 hours without initiating any movement. The analytical question that resists resolution, no matter how many times the sequence of events is examined from different positions, is this: if Diane had not moved from her seat, if she had allowed the burial to proceed, if she had proceeded on the assumption that Patricia would eventually locate the drawer and access the truth through its contents on a private timeline, Patricia would still have found it. The drawer and the letter were positioned precisely so that she would find them. Raymond had engineered the disclosure. Diane had no awareness of the letter's existence. She had no knowledge that the drawer held a complete confession, a collection of birthday cards from a child, and a legally structured financial instrument already recorded in that child's name. She had walked to the pulpit because 9 years of waiting for Raymond to act had concluded with his death before any action occurred, and she was not willing to extend her reliance on circumstances to deliver what human agency had consistently failed to deliver. In this position she was simultaneously right and wrong. Right because the truth had an independent claim on the living regardless of the elegance of its delivery mechanism. Possibly wrong in her assessment of the timeline, because the letter, the drawer, and the estate process created a disclosure pathway that was already operational. Or perhaps not wrong at all, because what if Patricia had not opened the drawer? What if grief had locked that study for months? What if the estate solicitor had failed to identify the private account? What if Marcus had grown toward adulthood holding a trust fund he could not trace to its source and a father whose identity remained formally unknown to him? These are not answerable questions. They sit in the space where certainty runs out. Raymond Cole does not represent the category of human failure that permits comfortable distancing. A genuine predator is navigable, the moral arithmetic is straightforward, and the observer can place themselves at a clean remove. A man who generated authentic, documentable good in the world while sustaining authentic, documentable harm in private is a different and considerably more uncomfortable category of subject. He is the person who avoided the hardest conversation. Who held the truth too long. Who wrote the letter he should have delivered in person while he was still alive enough to hand it across a table. Raymond Cole simply scaled his version of that particular failure to a magnitude that overtook him at the worst available moment. And the question of whether Diane was justified admits no clean resolution. She entered a room containing 312 people who were engaged in a necessary ritual, one that Patricia required, that Raymond's 3 children required, that the community required, and she interrupted it with no warning and no softening. She delivered factual truth in the harshest possible setting at the most exposed possible moment. And the truth had an absolute claim on being delivered. Both of those assessments are simultaneously accurate. The unresolvable tension between them is precisely the reason the argument continues wherever this story is raised. One position holds that the drawer existed, the letter existed, the estate process would have surfaced the trust within weeks, and there was no necessity to make Patricia's discovery a public event witnessed by 300 of her neighbors. That position is not dismissible. The opposing position holds that Diane had watched 9 years pass while Raymond found reasons to defer, had then watched him be formally canonized in front of a room full of people who believed every word, and possessed zero actionable guarantee that the drawer would be opened, that the letter would be found, or that it wouldn't be boxed and stored and encountered years later or never at all. That position is equally not dismissible. The resolution depends entirely on what position one occupies regarding the fundamental purpose of truth, whether truth is unconditionally owed to the living regardless of delivery cost, or whether truth without mercy is simply cruelty operating under truth's designation. Both frameworks have genuine intellectual weight. Neither produces a verdict that fully satisfies. The question worth sitting with is not the simplified binary of right or wrong. The question is this: viewed from Patricia's position, was Diane's action desirable? Viewed from Marcus's position, was it desirable? Those two questions are likely to produce different answers for the vast majority of people who engage with them seriously. The gap between those two answers is not a defect in reasoning. That gap is where the actual moral substance of this entire account resides. Raymond Cole has been interred. The 43 letters are wherever Patricia determined they should be stored. Marcus is 7 years old and does not yet possess a complete understanding of who his father was. He will arrive at that understanding eventually. He will encounter the cards his father preserved. He will trace the architecture of the trust established in his name. He will receive, in whatever language Diane assembles when she judges the time appropriate, the full account of the man who called himself Uncle Ray, who visited 11 times in his final year, who kept those drawings in a locked drawer and composed a letter to his wife that he stored rather than delivered. Whatever judgment Marcus ultimately renders on that man, on the full, unedited version of him, the public one and the private one simultaneously, that judgment carries a weight that no other verdict in this case can approach. Every other observer is positioned on the outside of the story, reasoning about what they would have chosen differently, from a comfortable distance from the moment itself.